Well, I hope breaking things up is allowing for a little time to digest. And I want to now kind of take our next step from what we were just talking about a moment ago with a legislative aspect in 1975 that set six primary elements for what's been called the Bill of Rights for Children with Disabilities or Parents' Law. So think about this, the mid 70s now, nearly 10 years after the civil rights legislation, and nearly 20 years after the Brown versus Board of Education landmark decision, we are now legislating the fact that, individuals with disabilities are also individuals, and they also need to be protected, and they also need to be included. Now, when they defined special education, they talked about it as, first of all, specifically designed for or specially designed instruction. There's no cost to the parents, and there's a unique need aspect of the child that needs to be addressed. Now, they also talk about the fact that it can be conducted in a variety of places, back to the least restrictive environment. And I want to mention that least restrictive environment one more time. Many individuals think the least restricted environment is always the general education classroom. Now, for some individuals with, let's say, significant behavioral challenges, where being amongst their peers, being one of 25, or one of 20, or one of 30 students is just not appropriate. It's not their least restricted environment. They need more support. They need more guidance. They need more hands-on attention. That might be impossible in a class of 25 students. So their least restricted environment may be a place where they're having maybe one adult for every 3 students or every 6 students. I've taught in those environments, and those are great environments for certain individuals. Now, in terms of special education, let's break this down one more time. The big thing, the no cost. So for example, the transportation, getting to and from school, can't charge you for that. No cost, can't charge you for that extra related service professional, can't charge you for the additional tutoring, can't charge you for all the other elements that potentially schools in the past saw as an additional cost because of the disability and they wanted to charge for. All right, now as we take a look at the legislation, there's a progression to it. And it makes a lot of sense if you start thinking about it. So they initially passed it in 1975. And as I mentioned on Monday, the legislation initially started with the age of 6 and went to 18. Makes sense. Kindergarten through high school, right? Okay. Well, as they reflected on this, and as education itself continued to evolve, there was a movement there in the 70s and 80s, if not before, actually with Head Start in the 1960s, that, if we start with early childhood, before kindergarten, we may have some growth potential. We may be able to support individuals. And so by the 1980s, it's almost 20 years of Head Start work, we're realizing that there are some indications that supportive individuals, when they're younger, before kindergarten, for individuals that are potentially likely for more challenges, we may be able to have some success. And some of the argument is, well, we'll prevent the challenge when it comes to kindergarten and on. And that actually philosophy continues. And so anyways, during the 80s, there's a movement to amend what we now refer to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or it was still referred to as the Education of Handicapped Children's Act. But anyways, we amend this in the 80s to basically include 3, and then by the 90s, we go all the way down to birth. But initially, it's 3 to 5, meaning preschool, and it would be only for individuals with disabilities, and those individuals would be served. And then, of course, they would switch from 3 to 5 into elementary. And we'll talk a bit more about that here in just a moment. But during the 80s, things were revived, things were altered. And then, of course, we're going to go the opposite way here in just a moment in terms of up to 21. So then, well, actually, I was about to go into the next legislation, but then in 1983, there was a seeking need for clarity. So think about this. So the legislation's passed, there's some things taking place, and then by 1983, there's some questions being had. And the particular question is, well, what are public schools required to do? What is appropriate? And so Congress, you offered appropriate, but this definition is a little unclear. And so there's a case and as are continue to be court cases, and this is a key point, folks, that legislation is passed, litigation will follow and continue to follow. This is a living, breathing law. Yes, it will be revised by Congress, but it'll also be further interpreted by the courts. And this is a big case. And this big case was the fact that there was a girl by the name of Amy Raleigh who was deaf, I want to say in New Jersey, who was not getting access to an interpreter, sign language interpreter. Mom and dad felt that she would be doing so much better in elementary school if she had the ability to have an interpreter. Well, the school was saying, well, she's doing fine. She's in the general education environment. She's progressing. She's doing quite well in terms of overall peer interaction and grades and things of that nature. So this is appropriate. We don't have to give her everything. And so there was a discussion, and the courts basically, the Supreme Court decided the following. First of all, in testing to determine whether or not free appropriate public education has been provided, the first thing they want to find out is, has the district followed the procedures for adequately provide elements of what's appropriate for FAPE? And the second one is the IEP reasonably calculated to basically see if the child is going to benefit. And one benefit would be, are they in the general education classroom? Are they progressing with their peers? Are they progressing at the rate with their peers that would be appropriate for all learners? And that is the Rowley criteria. So what it's not doing is it's not promising, in car vernacular, the Cadillac or the Lexus. It's promising the Chevy. It's promising the Toyota Corolla. Basically, it's promising a basic education where the individual is going to learn, the individual is going to participate and succeed, but it doesn't have to have the best education, the most perfect education. This is critical because this really clarifies things for schools for, well, up until today, 2018. All right, so as we move through, beyond the litigation, there's a continuation of the legislation that grows to further to gain further clarity. So by the 1990s, a couple things are happening. First of all, what about disability groups that 15 years ago you didn't include? Autism is one. And you're like, autism was just included in 1990? Yes. And then also traumatic brain injury. Those two were added in 1990. But there was a lot of discussion in the 1980s about what about ADHD? And actually, it was not included. And we'll talk about that here in the next part of the presentation. But it was not included. And there's reasons why, and I'll get to that. But the other thing in 1990 was transition services. And this was particularly relevant because think about it. Now the students have been through the education system for 15 years. You have a number of students that are graduating, that are finishing up, that are completing, they're moving out of the system. Well, now the question is, what are they doing? How successful were they? Did we prepare them for that transition? And the reality is we didn't. And so Congress and legislated the need to prepare individuals for transition, something we'll talk about later on this semester, but that's added, think about it, 15 years later of the initial legislation. It makes a lot of sense. Now, 7 years later, we have IDEIA. Oh, and by the way, they also refer to, in 1990, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So person first and getting rid of handicap and adding in disabilities. By 1997, there's a big movement in the 90s for state assessment. And so this is all part of that Goals 2000 element. And so wait a minute, if you are having state assessments and you're excluding individuals with disabilities, then you're also excluding them from the initiatives that follow based on the state assessments. Therefore, you're excluding them possibly from the general education initiatives. Oops, you need to include them. And there's also an issue of behavior. We had a lot of instances where we were concerned about the behavior of individuals and how can we service them, but also be safe for them and the rest of their peers. And that was clarified in 1997 as well through what's called manifestation determination, something we'll talk about later on this semester. And then finally, the legislation we're working under today, they added in this Improvement Act, but people still refer to it as IDEA, not IDEIA. And there was a movement towards response intervention and tier-based intervention, which again we'll talk about as we go on this semester. And this idea of evidence-based practice, another critical element that hopefully you're learning about in your methods classes. You'll learn about in a subsequent class with us in disabilities. But there's been a huge push since No Child Left Behind that what we do in education should be evidence-based. We better have evidence behind what we do. So this is reflected in 2004 with the revision of IDEA. So back to revisions of legislation or passage of legislation that reflects society. These are three perfect examples. So autism is basically making a big push in society. In 1990, we need to include it as a definition. Oh, and by the way, we're having medical advances are finding that a lot of individuals that would have died due to traumatic brain are now alive and they need to be served in schools. 1997, big push for state assessments in society. Are we teaching what we need to teach? Therefore, we need to include kids with disabilities in those. And by the way, we want safe schools. Throughout the 90s, we have safe school issues. Well, how are we going to do that with behavior with kids with disabilities? There we go. It's part of the legislation. And finally, 2004, this idea that, hey, what we do in schools better be evidence-based. Well, it better be with individuals with disabilities as well. Now, IDEA has 4 parts, folks. And I just want to make sure you're realizing that there are 4 parts. Our part, and we're not really going to say, oh, part B and refer to it that way, but that's where we're going to focus. And that's students that are aged 3 to 21. Part A is more definitions, findings, structure, and all that for what's part of IDEA. Part C is birth to 3, and we will mention that here as we go along. We may have some speakers that talk to that as well, and that's a little different. Instead of an IEP, you have an Individual Family Service Plan, IFSP, and a lot of different things going on there. Actually, services are at home versus in some sort of setting generally. And the last one is helping out LEAs, which would be our local schools, local education agencies, local schools, and also helping out and building capacity within our states. And that's the state education agency. So L is our school district, S is our state entities. Okay, so that's kind of just thinking about this aspect. That's basically IDEA, these 6 major concepts. And these 6 major concepts are going to really be what we talk about throughout the semester, and the kind of foundation elements, everything from let's talk about FAPE, let's talk about LRE, what does an IEP process look like and what does it involve? You'll hear a lot about parental participation through my perspective as a parent, and etc. Now, as we kind of close out this section of our overview, you might be thinking, but Sean, who are we talking about? And I'm curious, feel free to stop this right now and see if you could brainstorm the 13 different categories for disabilities. Okay, maybe you didn't stop, maybe you didn't take a break. So let's take a look at those 13 categories. So I've tried to organize them based on prevalence, meaning that the number 1 would be specific learning disability. And then down towards the second column at the end, multiple disabilities would be your less prevalent, less likely. And you're saying, well, Sean, autism is number 5. Isn't that like huge? It's growing and growing and growing, and it very well may go up the list. But right now, it's about 5th nationally in terms of number-wise. And you may look at other health impaired and wonder, well, what is that, Sean? We'll talk about that in greater detail, but the simple answer is individuals with ADHD that are not included, of course, because there's no separate definition for them, but do have significant challenges, they would be served under OHI or other health impaired. That's an area that's grown tremendously since the 1990s. All right, we'll talk about those other areas here as we go along, but just wanted to share with you, these are the disability categories that you'll have to be assessed for and determined to have in order to have access to the IEP, in order to have access to the least restricted environment, in order to have access to FAPE, and all those elements, due process, the parental support. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section here in just a moment. Hope this makes some sense, and this is the end of part 2.